Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. Apologies for being late because we are encountering some technical issues, but we have Professor Cheeseman with us today, so we are very happy with that. Unfortunately, the webcam will not work, but we will be able to hear Professor Cheeseman and also show the PowerPoint. Before we go into the presentation, please allow me a few words as a kind of introduction. This is the third lecture of our RECONNECT Webinar Series on democratic and rule of law backsliding, causes, consequences, and prospects from around the world. And as some of you might know, in this webinar series, we take stock of major developments with regard to democratic backsliding in specific countries and regions around the globe. Today, we are happy to welcome Professor Nick Cheeseman, who will share insights on recent developments based on his extensive research from Africa, with a specific focus on Kenya, Ghana, Uganda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. This global webinar series from RECONNECT was intended to look a little bit beyond Europe, because as some of you might know, our RECONNECT project, which is funded by a Horizon 2020 grant from the European Commission, focuses very much on dynamics inside Europe, but we want to understand the broader context of rule of law and democratic backsliding. Today we will be focusing, as I said, on Africa. Media headlines suggest that Africa is slipping back into authoritarianism, but a systematic evaluation of the continent reveals relatively modest levels of overall change in democratic performance in recent years, with positive developments in some countries cancelling out negative ones in others. However, the combination of economic downturn due to COVID-19, growing debt, and a lack of international focus on protecting democracy raised doubts on developments for 2021 and future years. This is important because research demonstrates that on average, democracies perform better, not only on human rights, but also in terms of economic growth, human development, and corruption. With Professor Cheeseman, we have a leading expert with us today to discuss these issues. Professor Cheeseman is Professor of Democracy at the University of Birmingham and was formerly the Director of the African Studies Center at the University of Oxford. He mainly works on democracy, elections, and development, and has published research on several African countries. Professor Cheeseman is the author and editor of more than 10 books, including recent books such as The Moral Economy of Elections in Africa. In recognition of his academic and contribution, the Political Studies Association of the United Kingdom awarded him the Joni Lowandowski Prize for Outstanding Professional Achievement by a Mid-Career Scholar in 2019, the same year as efforts to promote better understanding of democracy and how it can be protected and strengthened around the world, won the Celebrating Impact Prize of the Economic and Social Research Council for outstanding international impact. He is a frequent commentator of African and global events for many different leading news outlets, including Financial Times, Economist, Washington Post, and BBC. So I promised a webinar with participants from many different countries and parts of the world. It will last for approximately 45 minutes. So with bit of the delayed start, we will go a bit over our deadline of 4:45. Feel free to engage with us. Feel free to send us your questions, and you can send them to us through the chat box. After the presentation of Professor Cheeseman, we will try to feed in a Q&A session your questions to him, and then he can also answer. It's now my great pleasure to hand over to Professor Cheeseman.
Welcome, everybody. So, talking about democracy and authoritarianism over 20 years in a continent as diverse as Africa is inherently fraught with danger. But what I'm going to try and do today is start by talking about some of the general patterns and then go down and look at some regional variations, then look at some country case studies to try and move from the general to the particular to avoid overgeneralizing. But if I had to sum up what I'm going to say today, it would be these following points. First, views of the death of democracy in Africa has been greatly exaggerated. I'm going to argue today that actually for most of the last 20 years, there has not been a significant decline in the quality of democracy in Africa. neither has there been a significant increase in the quality of democracy. That's partly because some improvements in some countries have been wiped out by some declines in others, but it's also because we see a lot more stability in African countries than is often given credit for. The media depiction of chaos and rapid change is actually not what we see when we look at the continent as a series of countries over the last 20 years. Secondly, we have relatively little evidence of significant pronounced democratization, as I've said, except perhaps in the last few years. And we can talk at the end of my discussion today about whether or not we're seeing a new moment in which we see a particularly pronounced threat to democracy in Africa. But that's not something that we've really seen over the last 20 years, interestingly. So I'm going to kind of challenge that idea of prolonged democratic decline. Instead, I'm going to argue that many African countries, perhaps the vast majority of African countries, are what we might think of as being a kind of competitive authoritarian equilibrium. In other words, the majority of countries hold elections but constrain the ability of the opposition to win them, and have done so since the mid-1990s to the present day. It's relatively rare for a country to go from being classified as a democracy into this category, and it's relatively rare for countries from the sort of hard authoritarian category to become full democracies. So I'm going to suggest that we see relative stability in the kind of ways that we tend to categorize countries in Africa. And finally, as I say, I'll end by highlighting some contemporary trends that we might worry are shifting this pattern. So the state of democracy in Africa, if you could see it, I would be showing you a wonderful map of democracy in Africa, in which you would see the quality of democracy broken down in different regions. And what you would see, if this map was on your screen, is that you have relatively high numbers of free countries in Southern Africa, most notably Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa, but very few free countries in the rest of the continent. West Africa is generally regarded, this map is put together by Freedom House, so West Africa is generally partly free. Very few countries in West Africa that are not free, but very few that are fully free. And if you looked at Eastern Africa, you would see quite a few countries that are, again, partly free. But if you went into the Central Africa and the Horn of Africa, you would see that almost all countries are now regarded as not free. So one of the things I wanted to bring out very early on, and this does it, is that we have relatively small numbers of full democracies in Africa. We have quite a large number of countries that are kind of partly free, and we have probably roughly the same number or slightly lower number of countries that are really quite authoritarian. Okay, so this table gives you the distribution of African political systems by type of political system. Now, as you all know, we can't differentiate between political systems in sub-Saharan Africa on the basis of whether or not they hold elections, because pretty much every country apart from Eritrea holds multi-party elections, and therefore we have to find other ways. So what this is showing you is the countries that are rated as being full democracies, those that are seen as being hard autocracies. So hard autocracies are countries that hold elections but constrain political space in civil society to such a great extent that the opposition really can't get any kind of a foothold, for example, in parliament. And then mixed systems where there are some authoritarian constraints and some elements of democracy, and elections are typically fairly competitive, but the ruling party still wins most of the time. So as I was saying, what you can see here is no matter what ratings index you use, there are relatively few full democracies in sub-Saharan Africa. But there are also not as many hard autocracies as people might think. What's really happening is a bunching of countries in the middle. And you can see here that for Freedom House, for V-DEM, for BTI, the vast majority of African political systems are actually coming in this middle ground, with elements of democracy, elements of authoritarianism, not full democracies nor hard autocracies. Next slide, please. So the first point I wanted to bring across is that we see relatively few democracies, and as I've said, most countries are actually in this competitive authoritarian status. The second thing I just want to bring out quickly, just so that we're all clear, is that there are significant variations in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa. We can talk in the Q&A about the extent to which these variations on the screen right now are causal or were related to regional identities, or whether they're actually, accidental and products of other factors. But what you can see is sustained by most democracy ratings agencies is that Southern Africa and West Africa are generally seen as being far more democratic on average than Central and East Africa. What you can also see, and again this is sustained by most rating agencies, is that Southern Africa reached a relatively high quality of democracy in the early 1990s and has sustained it pretty much to the present day. There's not a lot of variation if you look at that from 1995 onwards. West Africa has become more democratic over time, increasingly until 2017. It would have become a bit less democratic in the last 2 years because of the backsliding we've seen in Benin and Senegal. Whereas Central and East Africa, having had a significant kind of rise in the early 1990s, have faded away and become gradually more authoritarian. So 2 important things to take from this figure. The first important thing to take from this is that we see very different levels of democracy in different regions, admitting that those averages, cover an awful lot of variation within region as well as between region. And secondly, there seems to be a bit of a trend over time in that the gap between these regions is actually increasing. So West Africa seems to have been getting more democratic at the same time that Central and East Africa appear to have been getting less democratic. Southern Africa seems to have been fairly stable. Next slide, please. Just to show you that this pattern applies no matter what index we use. This is the Bertelsmann Transformation Index over a similar period of time. And you can see again that West Africa is seen to have got more democratic over this period. Southern Africa has stayed fairly much where it is. And East and Central Africa are seen to have increased on the BTI until about 2002, 2006, 2007 and declined thereafter. The other thing that this particular graph brings out very nicely, again, is the fact that most of Africa is stuck in this middle ground. So the BTI index is a 0 to 10 index, where 10 is the best quality democracy and 1 is the worst quality democracy. And you can see that all of the regions of sub-Saharan Africa are sort of sandwiched in between 7 and 3. So none are in that very high quality democracy barrier at the very top, and none are actually in that incredibly low democracy barrier at the very bottom. They're all stuck in this relative middle ground. Next slide, please. So let's move beyond those big averages, which of course conceal much more than they reveal in some ways, and let's start breaking this down. Next slide, please. So what does it look like if we look at a particular region? So I'm going to start by focusing on Southern Africa. And what's remarkable about Southern Africa, and it really brings out this point that I'm trying to push, that we might have seen a lot more stability than people give credit for over the last 20 years, is if you look at the VDEM score. So VDEM score is 0 to 1. 1 is most democratic, 0 is least democratic. I'm showing you here the Liberal Democracy Index, but I could be showing you the Elections Index, and multiple different dimensions of democracy have roughly the same pattern. If you look here, what you see in Southern Africa as an average is remarkable. Almost 0 change from 1996 to 2020 in the VDEM average score for Southern Africa. Now, you might think this is being driven by some countries doing better and some countries doing worse, and there's a little bit of that balancing out, and I'll talk about that later. But if we can move to the next slide, what you'll actually also see is this remarkable consistency of individual countries. So this is a graph that shows you all of the countries that we could think of as potentially being in Southern Africa. I put Tanzania in there right now, but some would take that out. But the other countries, I think, are fairly straightforwardly Southern African countries. And you can see 2 things. The first, if we move to the next slide, is that there's a significant increase in the vast majority of countries in the early 1990s in terms of an improvement in the quality of democracy. It's not in Botswana, because of course Botswana is one of the only countries, along with Mauritius, to hold multi-party elections from independence onwards. But in most of the other countries, the reintroduction of multi-party politics leads to a significant improvement there. If we can go to the next slide, please. There's possibly a little bit of a change there at the end as well, in that we see perhaps a tailing off in some of these countries in terms of a slight reduction in the quality of democracy at the very end. But if we move to the next slide, one of the things that we'll see is that actually between 1996 and the present day, in other words, if we look particularly after that initial transition at the beginning of the multi-party period to the present day, we see very little significant change in any of these country trajectories. At the very bottom there, you can see Angola making some slight incremental improvements over the period. You can see a little bit of variation in countries like Botswana, little bit of variation there in countries like Zambia, but there's not a dramatic variation in any one of these countries apart from, if we see the next slide, Madagascar, which of course has a process of instability, coup, and tension between leaders such as President Ravalomanana and President Rajoelina, and that tension leads to considerable restructuring of the political system and a political breakdown that undermines democracy and leads to a significant kind of diversion there, and then a move back up to a high level of democracy when civilian government is re-established. But if you take Madagascar out, there's remarkable stability in all of these other country scores over this long period of time. Next slide, please. So what I've shown so far is actually there are regional differences that are important to take into effect. There is some movement between the regions. I've suggested Southern and West Africa seem to be getting a bit more democratic, or at least were until 2018, 2019. East and Central Africa were getting a bit less democratic, but that actually when we start to break this down, there's nowhere near as much variation on a country level as we might expect. Now, there's two possible explanations. One explanation would be that the democracy ratings indices get it wrong. And it could be that partly what's happening here is people are evaluating democracies over long periods of time for relatively new data sets. And in doing so, they're generating more homogeneity over those results than perhaps would have been the case if they'd have been doing it contemporaneously. It could also be the case that there's a kind of groupthink and people are sort of taking cues from different data sets, and that's why we get the coherence across the data set. So it's not impossible that there's a challenge to the data, but it's also possible that the data is telling us something that we really need to take account of, which is actually, as I've said, that there's maybe a lot more stability here than we've recognized so far. So let me just go through a few key case studies that people might have thought would have seen significant change over the last 20 years. Benin, one of Africa's greatest hopes, a country in West Africa that was one of the first countries in Africa to see an opposition win following the reintroduction of multi-party politics. Then, of course, President Kerekou, who had been in charge during the one-party state, did his phoenix-like resurrection from the flames and actually won an election. So Benin becoming one of the first countries in Africa to have two transfers of power. But recently, we've seen a very different trend in Benin with a president who seems to be trying to return it to a one-party state, electoral boycotts, flawed processes, and a decline in the quality of democracy. So we might expect to see some significant difference there. Ethiopia, of course, is an interesting case. We start with a highly controlled authoritarian state under Meles. We go through a period of reform that appears to be bringing about a much more significant and democratic opening, only for that to be closed and the conflict in Tigray, and now a much more authoritarian stance, including high levels of censorship being taken by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, despite winning his Nobel Peace Prize. We then have Sudan, which of course was a militarized authoritarian regime for much of this period, but then saw mass popular protests bring down the president and lead to a new political dispensation. Tanzania, where of course many people felt that the country was on a democratizing pathway until President John Magufuli, and Magufuli comes in and puts forward his idiosyncratic brand of populism, and perhaps is then uses more authoritarian strategies to really force the opposition back, winning a landslide election victory before his untimely death. Uganda, where again people perhaps felt there was a kind of democratizing trajectory until perhaps the last election, where Bobby Wine, the musician turned political leader who's galvanized many young people and members of the middle class in Uganda around a change agenda, appeared to have great momentum until high levels of repression, arrests of Bobby Wine, intimidation of Bobby Wine, the arrest and intimidation of hundreds of his supporters, many of whom are still missing, led to a very problematic election combined with high levels of electoral manipulation. And of course, finally, Zimbabwe, which again, there were ideas of a reform moment around Robert Mugabe's removal from power in the military-assisted transition and his replacement by President Emmerson Mnangagwa, who, when he came to power, promised free, fair elections and significant political openings. Now, if you look at these cases, I think instinctively a lot of people would assume there's been a lot of difference in countries like Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia. But I think actually if we went through the case studies of each of these countries carefully, and I won't do it now because I've run out of time, but we can do it in the Q&A if people want to come back to these, we might actually say that it's true that there's been much more consistency than perhaps other ratings indices would have suggested, so perhaps other arguments would have suggested. So Benin has definitely declined in terms of the overall quality of democracy in the last few years. Ethiopia, it's not clear to me, really has. Effectively, what we have now is an authoritarian state manipulating elections to stay in power and using violence, which is basically what it was under the EPRDF. Seems to me that despite a blip of potential reform, that's continuity. Sudan has seen a major transition, and it is significant that Bashir is no longer in power, but we still have significant figures from the old regime and the military constraining the possibility of democratization. And it's not clear that Sudan has made a significant democratic breakthrough that will allow for popular pressure to genuinely have free and fair elections. Tanzania did become a bit more repressive under President Magufuli, but it's perhaps misleading to think it was on a democratizing path. CCM has always used coercion and control to maintain its dominance of the political system, and it's never come close to losing an election. In Uganda, people forget that just the same violence that was meted out to Bobi Wine in the last election was actually meted out to Kizza Besigye back in the early 2000s, and that Uganda had a process of extremely violent elections at that period. Similarly for Zimbabwe, we had a very short-lived moment where for a few months it looked like Emerson Mnangagwa might do something different to the kind of ZANU-PF modus operandi, but very quickly reverted to type. And in many ways, the actions of his regime now are fairly reminiscent of the actions of Robert Mugabe's regime. So in all of these countries, perhaps with the exception of Benin, what might be said is that actually the illusion of reform and transition was what we need to probe, that actually the democracy ratings indices might be correct. It might be that in those moments of hope and optimism, we believed that was going to be more significant transition than was really feasible. In other words, that the systems that are in place in these countries are fairly sticky, they're fairly entrenched, and they're fairly hard to change. The changes of leadership, which we often latch onto as moments of opportunity and moments of reform, actually have done relatively little to change the underlying political structures in these countries. And that as a result, they remain roughly where they are on the democracy scale to where they would have been in the early 1990s. Next slide, please. And just to show you what that looks like, you know, it's actually interesting. If you go to the V-DEM Index, you can see Benin at the top, as I say, that looks relatively good and stable, but then declined significantly from 2016 onwards. But if you look at most of the other countries, as I've said before, there's actually relative stability here. Zimbabwe goes down a bit, then up a bit, then down a bit. Uganda goes up a bit, then down a bit. But broadly speaking, most of the countries that I've just talked about, at least according to the V-DEM Index, are roughly where they were on the democracy scale at the end of 2019 as they were at the end of 1998. There's not the kind of variation that our popular narrative about some of these countries might suggest. Next slide, please. So this actually brings me back to a report that I wrote last year for the Bertelsmann Transformation Index. I've talked particularly about Southern Africa here, but I just want to use this report to highlight that I think this is a much broader issue. And in this report, which reviewed all of the countries in which the BTI operates, which is most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, if we move to the next slide, I wrote this, this sort of paragraph for the executive summary. Contrary to media depictions of sub-Saharan Africa, in many countries, political changes tended to occur gradually. From 2015 to 2019, the general pattern has been for the continent's more authoritarian states, such as Djibouti, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, and Rwanda, to make little progress towards democracy and in some cases to become incrementally more repressive. At the same time, many of the continent's more democratic states, Botswana, Ghana, Mauritius, Senegal, and South Africa, have remained consolidating or defective democracies, with very few dropping out to become authoritarian regimes. Overall, only 16 countries saw their ranking in any one of the categories between the last two rounds of the survey change significantly. The main exceptions to this rule are countries that have suffered a rapid escalation of conflict, such as South Sudan in 2013, or the sudden collapse of the government, such as Burkina Faso in 2015. So what I'm suggesting here for Southern Africa, I'm saying to some extent can hold true for other parts of the continent as well. Next slide, please. So this leads to the question of how we explain stability rather than change. What if what we need to be doing in sub-Saharan Africa is not explaining democratic decline and backsliding, but actually the fact that most countries are roughly where they were in the mid-1990s? Next slide, please. I think there's two ways that we could perhaps go about that. The first set of hypotheses would be to say maybe there's a set of consistent constraints that are operating on leaders that are preventing them from becoming fully democratic, but also preventing them from completely sliding back into closed autocracies that don't hold elections and don't allow any opposition at all. If we wanted to push that argument, we might say, well, it's still important for countries to look democratic internationally. There's still some badge of honor by being a member of the elected leader club. That some of the socio-economic drivers we could talk about, for example, the expansion of the African middle class, the explosion of civil society following the reintroduction of multi-party politics in the early 1990s, has led to greater institutional kind of social support for multi-party democracy. That, of course, in many countries we have very competitive elites, many of whom want to have an access or the ability to share power, who would not accept the end of multi-party politics because it would be the end of their opportunity to win power again in the future. And finally, strong popular support for democratic principles. But of these, I think, it doesn't really persuade me when we look at the first two. I think the international support for democracy has been so patchy and inconsistent over the last decade. The rise of other powers such as China, Turkey, India, Brazil, Iran, Israel, Russia, that don't prioritize democracy promotion has created such a complicated picture that I don't fully believe that the international picture is what's holding democracy in Africa in place. It's playing a supportive role, but I don't think that's where I would put most of my emphasis. It's important to note that there has been the rise of the middle class, but a lot of my research has cast doubt on quite how big that middle class is and quite how democratic that middle class is. And so I'm slightly suspicious of the socio-economic drivers as well as a kind of explanation of this continuity. So when it comes to the sort of background conditions, the two that I think perhaps are more significant are the determination of a broad range of elites to have access and share power. In other words, the fact that it seems almost impossible to imagine what you would do other than multi-party politics in a diverse, competitive country like Nigeria or Kenya, and the fact that there is still popular support for democratic principles. If we move to the next slide, one of the things we'll see is that, for example, in the Southern African countries I've just been talking about, support for democracy is actually fairly robust. Now, if you follow Afrobarometer data, and this is all taken from the Afrobarometer, go to the afrobarometer.org because it's a brilliant website that will provide you with all sorts of fantastic data for free. One of the things we know looking at Afrobarometer data over the last few years is that there has been a significant decline in satisfaction with democracy in Africa. There's been a significant decline in people's belief in elections as a way of holding governments accountable and generating better policy. And those two things have impacted on demand for democracy. So there is a weakening of popular demand for democratic government as a result, it seems, of growing dissatisfaction and recognition of problematic elections. But despite that downward trend, which is very discouraging and which we need to take account of and pay serious attention to, it's nonetheless true that if you look at the difference in support for democracy in the countries that I was talking about in Southern Africa from 2002 to 2016 to 2018, what you can see is that actually support for democracy as a most preferable form of government remains relatively robust. In Zimbabwe, it's gone up considerably from 47% to 75%. In Zambia, it's gone from 70% to 82%. In South Africa is one of the only countries where it actually seems to have gone down a little bit from 57% saying democracy is the most preferable to 54%. But in almost all the other cases, we actually see support for democracy increasing during this period, despite the fact that in many of these countries, democracy has not performed particularly well. Next slide. We also see relatively strong and robust support for multi-party elections. So the red bar on the left-hand side here is people who strongly support the idea that we should have elections to select leaders. And again, you can see that there's a couple of places where it's not gone up so much. So South Africa and Malawi are the two where it's actually gone down, popular support for elections. But Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, in Botswana, we see increases in support for choosing leaders through elections. Malawi, it goes down considerably, but this is just before the 2020 rerun election in Malawi, and I bet if we did it now, we would see Malawi being significantly higher. So there are a couple of countries here when support for elections has declined, Mozambique there, etc., Zimbabwe, but there's also relative stability in a number of countries in which it's improved. So I think popular support for democracy is not an insignificant consideration in explaining why it's been so consistent in so many countries. Next slide. So the alternative to thinking about constraints that have remained the same from the 1990s to today, so the idea there being we see the same level of democracy because we have the same conditions in place, is that actually there were certain things that happened in the early 1990s that locked in certain practices and institutions, and that there's been a kind of path dependency. A lot of people don't like the term path dependency, but I've used it here because it covers a multitude of sins. But if you wanted to talk about it more theoretically, we could talk about a kind of historical institutionalist approach to understanding democratization, in which a number of things that happened in the early 1990s fix politics in certain ways that then generate a high level of stability over time. So 3 hypotheses for what that might look like or mean. On the one hand, Rachel Riedl's very persuasive argument that at the moment of transition in the early 1990s, the balance of power between the opposition and the ruling party was kind of baked into institutional arrangements. Where the opposition was dominant, you got far more constitutional change, which then supported a much more democratic political system. Where the ruling party was dominant, you got minimal change, which meant that you had minimal opportunities to open up the political system, which then sustained more authoritarian systems. A second potential kind of path-dependent argument here would be that some of the early practices of leaders set in place motions that then constrained their successors. So Posner and Young's article in 2018, that basically in every country in which the first president respected presidential term limits, the second president also respected presidential term limits, whereas in most of those countries in which the first president did not respect presidential term limits, successive presidents have also not respected presidential term limits. And thirdly, there could potentially be a bit of a regional effect. It could be that more democratic regions that became more democratic in the early 1990s established more democratic regional bodies, and that those regional bodies have then been insisting on democratic practice, which again has kind of locked in more democratic behavior in certain parts of Africa, West Africa and Southern Africa, in a way that simply hasn't happened elsewhere. And of course, we could think of the role of ECOWAS in Gambia and SADC in Lesotho as being particularly significant to that. When it comes to these path dependencies, I think my intuition is that we should be looking at the first two. I think it is significant that at the moment of transition, the negotiating process and the balance of power between the parties led to different levels of institutional change, and that institutionalized in constitutions, but also in legislation, different political systems that created more or less opportunity for genuine contestation. And I think that is one of the reasons why we've seen quite a lot of stickiness and consistency from there on in. I also think some of these early practices by political leaders are significant, and that precedent setting has been important. I'm less convinced on the regional effects. I think it's true that ECOWAS and SADC have played a significant role in very small countries when it comes to promoting democracy, but when it comes to promoting democracy in larger countries, Nigeria, Angola, they've obviously been very silent and marginal. So I'm not sure that the regional effects has such an important role. So where does that leave me? It leaves me arguing to you today that there's more consistency than we would imagine. The death of democracy in Africa has been massively overstated, that what we've actually seen is a consolidation of most countries in a kind of competitive authoritarian middle ground. We have not seen that many countries move out of that to democratization, but we've neither seen that many countries move out of that into becoming really closed authoritarian regimes. And the explanation for that consistency perhaps lies in a combination of the determination of elites to have a share of power and to maintain a more plural system, popular support for the idea of democracy, the key way in which the balance of power at the transition moment was baked into institutional arrangements and precedent setting at the early stage in the 1990s by key political leaders. Next slide, please. But then, just to wrap up, and this is my final slide, I think we then need to ask a question about, are things changing? We've seen, and if you look at Freedom House, and if you look at some of the pieces that myself and others have written about the last couple of years, a really big concern about the correlation between COVID-19 and rising authoritarian abuses. We've seen attacks on journalists in many countries trying to report on COVID-19 figures, the use of COVID-19 to enforce social distancing to prevent opposition parties from holding rallies, and a range of other problematic processes in a number of cases. So, if we take off from there, how bad can things get? Well, we know that COVID-19 is going to create an economic crisis. We've already seen Zambia have a debt default, not because of COVID-19, but it exacerbated it. Many countries around Africa are severely hampered right now in terms of foreign exchange because tourism is not possible, and that's also having a significant impact on jobs and employment. So that's a significant set of challenges. At the same time, we know that we have a more multipolar international community in which those countries that typically promote democracy have, at least for the last 4 or 5 years, been consumed by their own difficulties, and now not only do not have a concerted focus on promoting democracy abroad, but lack the moral authority to do so. And we perhaps see a growing acceptance in some parts of Africa of a kind of gradual democratic backsliding. And if you put that together, the weakening of the international consensus, if there ever was one, COVID-19 and economic crisis is generating, you could create a very negative picture about what we should expect to see for the next 4 or 5 years when it comes to democracy. But I also wonder whether or not, again, we need to be cautious about predicting rapid change rather than continuity. For example, we know that actually democracies tend to perform better for both economic growth and public services on average in Africa. We know that urbanization is continuing apace and will challenge the existing models of retaining power. Many governments in Africa currently retain power by dominating the vote in rural areas, using traditional leaders and patron-client relations to do so. That's going to be increasingly difficult when populations become majority urban. And we know that most urban a lot of urban areas, especially capital cities, tend to vote more for the opposition than their rural counterparts. Not everywhere, and I've got a new research project on that we can discuss. And finally, it's also not clear that there's any alternatives to multi-party politics. It's not clear that in countries like Kenya or Nigeria, any alternative would deliver a higher level of political stability or a more sustainable model that would keep political elites happy. So although it's true that we're in a particularly difficult moment, and I suspect we will see a significant sort of bit of a decline in the quality of democracy on average in Africa next year, I think it's also important to keep in mind that this reason we've seen this consistency so far is because of these kinds of institutional constraints and because of this popular support. And it may well be that actually we don't see as much of a decline in the quality of democracy as we expect. And it may be that in some countries, democracy turns out to be a bit resilient and we see a bounce back after an initial bad 2 or 3 years. So although we're in a particularly difficult moment right now, the lesson of the last 20 years is that this isn't unlikely to be the death of democracy in Africa. Next slide, please. So stay in touch. Please do engage and follow the discussion. If you don't get to ask a question today, please feel free to do so on Twitter. And sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning, but thank you so much for moving the slides along. I think it worked okay in the end.
Thank you very much, Professor Cheeseman, for a very rich and very interesting overview. I also think that in the end it worked very well, and we were very well able to follow you and get all the information. And also many thanks for the very instructive slides, and the overviews are actually highlighting variation across time and countries, but also focusing very much on stability. In the meantime, we received quite a few questions, so if you allow me, I will move to the questions right away. And one question relates to the issue of corruption and the levels of corruption. To what degree does corruption drive this trend for stability, and what in your opinion, if anything can be done to address corruption in some of these countries, specifically in relation to what potentially international donors or other actors can do? Would you have any comments on that?
Thanks. I mean, when it comes to corruption, I mean, maybe taking that also in relationship to democracy, you know, one of the things that I think is often assumed is that strong leaders who are able to exert top-down control are the best solution to corruption. And the example of that people often give is Paul Kagame, because of course he's got this very centralized political system in which the kind of rents from the political system are reinvested in the economy rather than simply being, you know, externalized and put in Swiss bank accounts. And it's often seen as being, you know, a very productive model, reducing corruption and so on. I think actually the best way to reduce corruption in most countries is actually probably the other way. It's to try and increase accountability and increase transparency. And one of the things we see is that although there's a couple of African states that are authoritarian and perform very well on corruption, by and large, the most authoritarian states in Africa are the most corrupt. And the most democratic states in Africa are not corruption-free, but they are significantly less corrupt than the most authoritarian states. So my reason I think this is the case is as follows. I think if you can get the kind of top-down control Kagame has been able to achieve, then authoritarian restrictions on corruption might work. But actually what we see in most countries is leaders who have broad coalitions and need those coalitions to stay in power, and therefore can't exert the kind of authoritarian control Kagame can. And so when you take away the constraints that are posed by, for example, political competition, needing to win elections, etc., what you actually do in most countries is you foster the conditions for rampant corruption rather than reduce them. And so the Rwanda model, while it's attractive, can't actually be exported because that level of top-down control can't actually be achieved in most countries. And so a better model is actually to try and go the other way and to try and have political competition that reduces levels of corruption. And I think we're starting to see some of that, for example. I think if you look at Ghana, we've seen a couple of elections there, for example, the defeat of President Mahama in 2016, where the perception that the economic difficulties the country was having were partly rooted in the corruption problems of the government, where you actually see electorates starting to punish governments for perceived corruption. And I think when you start to see that happening, that's perhaps the best route to actually reducing corruption in plural societies that are going to have very competitive politics. And one of the things that we've seen, people like Michael Braddon have written journal articles on this, is that actually in a number of African countries, democratization and state building have gone hand in hand. And that actually where sort of authoritarian leaders have stayed in place, in other words, the kind of model of a benign authoritarian leader who will achieve state building and then democratize afterwards, in almost all of those cases, actually that authoritarian leader has failed to develop the state or build a national infrastructure or create a more unified population. And so actually most of the time, the idea that a benign dictator can kind of deliver state building or anti-corruption is actually flawed. And we see more progress in kind of new nascent democracies than we do in allowing authoritarian leaders to sort of remain in place.
Okay, thank you very much. There's also questions related to one issue you raised when you were talking about trying to understand these stabilities over time, and you were quite skeptical about possible influence of international pressures and the role of the middle class. But on that slide, you also mentioned the possible importance of civil society can play in fostering democracy. And we have a question in whether you think that the support of civil society actors, for instance, by international donors and foundations, and so does have a profound effect in Africa, in certain countries, on the promotion of democracy.
I think it does, but I think it's strongest when it's not donors supporting the civil society and the strong homegrown roots. So if we think about the most effective civil society actors over the last 20, 30 years, I would say, you know, some of those are clearly trade unions. If you think about the mass mobilization to stop President Chiluba getting a third term in Zambia in 2001, or the mass mobilization in support, you know, the then UDF to ensure the end of apartheid in South Africa, you know, trade unions played a critical role in that because of their critical role in the domestic economy. I think those kinds of organizations that have domestic roots and domestic legitimacy, religious organizations that want to stand up for human rights, law associations that have, significant prestige and authority, trade unions, those organizations can play a significant role in defending democracy. Organizations that are simply sustained from outside are not going to be able to mobilize individuals in quite the same way. But it's true that international support can help to foster civil society and help organizations to keep going in difficult financial times. I think one of the things that's a big worry for me when it comes to civil society is that some of those building blocks, and in terms of the examples that I just mentioned, have started to fade. So in countries like Zimbabwe and Zambia, a combination of privatization, informalization of labor, and so on has weakened the role of trade unions. They don't have the same membership or significance economically that they had before. Law associations in some countries, to return to Zambia, also there now under President Lungu, who's starting to be increasingly repressive as we move ahead towards the August 2021 general elections. Again, we're starting to see the repression of the Law Association of Zambia. So one of the things that worries me a little bit is some of those kind of key civil society building blocks or barriers have been significantly weakened by economic processes and by the efforts of the government over the last 10 years. And in that regard, it's perhaps worth mentioning here that, of course, one of the things that's really worrying about the last couple of years that I didn't mention in the talk is the growing use of censorship and cyber security legislation to try and censor people on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, people using blogs, and by doing so undermine the ability of people to have freedom of speech, which of course is central for the ability of civil society to function. So I think those organizations are important, and my big worry is that the ones that have the strongest domestic roots are slowly being weakened in a number of the countries that I've talked about.
Thank you very much. If you still have time, maybe for two questions. One actually builds a bit on the previous one, but does not focus that much on the role of civil society actors, but on the role of the young people and the youth in promoting democratization in Africa. How do you see that evolving over time? In all the data you analyze, do you see a stronger support for democratization among young people compared to other generations?
It's not actually as straightforward as you would think, partly because there are some countries in which young people, can't remember authoritarian regimes, and so they don't remember the economic and political failures of authoritarian regimes. And so there are some countries in which you do see parts of the youth who are more fervently supportive of democracy, but you also, in some cases, see young people being more willing to support the idea of a reversion to authoritarianism. So it's not a straightforward kind of model in which we can say younger people are always more democratic. Many are, and there's many important youth movements. We saw, for example, recently, young people playing a big role in the NSAS movement in Nigeria against police brutality, but also against the many failings of that political system. But we do have to be careful. And one of the things that I always say to people, because almost every time I work on a country or look at an election, someone tells me there's going to be an important youth vote in the next election. And I've never seen a youth vote materialize in a way that swung an election. For two reasons. One is that often young people are less likely to have national IDs and less likely to be registered to vote, partly because of the barriers to doing so. So 19 and 20 and 21-year-olds will often not have got those papers in order and won't be registered. But also, secondly, as Wilrino pointed out a long time ago in Nigeria and I think Sierra Leone, that in many countries, political leaders are very good at some point co-opting youth movements and youth members into existing political parties, ethnic networks, and so on. So that rather than the youth standing as a bloc on its own, as a youth party for youth issues, it gets subsumed into existing parties and therefore basically reinforces existing social divisions. I think it'll be really interesting to see in places like Nigeria with the NSAS movement, whether young people can maintain a kind of independent brand and resist that co-optation by the political system. But in most of the countries that I've worked on so far, a significant part of the youth have been subsumed in that kind of way.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe a final question, bringing it back to COVID and the current situation. You already mentioned several of the developments going on with regard to COVID and the installation of different emergency measures. Do you actually see these trends play out more in some countries than in others, or does it hold across the board, and you see similar types of emergency measures rolled out all over the continent?
No, that's a very good question, and we do see a lot of variation. I mean, some countries lock down very, very quickly. Some countries, remain much more open, and of course, some countries were more authoritarian to start with, and so the decline into sort of greater levels of repression has been accelerated. So, I'm thinking there of countries like Uganda and countries like Zambia and Tanzania, which were already sliding towards authoritarianism, and in which, we've seen perhaps COVID-19 has exacerbated existing trends rather than created trends from scratch. But I think it is significant that even in some of those countries that we might have thought were democratic or more democratic, South Africa, Ghana, even in some of those countries, we've seen things like excessive force by the security forces leading to major human rights violations around the enforcement of curfews. In Ghana, we saw the attacks on 2 or 3 journalists who were trying to report on COVID-19. So even in some of those more democratic states, COVID-19 does seem to have created tensions that have led to more kind of authoritarian incidents. My suspicion, though, would be going back to the kind of theme of the whole talk, that the way that COVID plays out in the next few years will very much reinforce rather than transform existing dynamics. So COVID will exacerbate problems in countries that are already being identified as moving towards authoritarianism, and will probably not create long-term problems in those countries that have been democratic, which will probably be bounced back and be more resilient and return to freedom of movement and freedom of speech relatively quickly. And in that sense, it will sort of consolidate the patterns that we've talked about. And again, perhaps that will lead to, more stability than it will to change.
Okay, thank you very much. There are quite a few other questions, but I'm afraid we don't have much more time, but we will convey the questions to you after the webinar, and you can maybe still engage with some of them. We want to thank you very much for a very interesting and engaging talk, which shed a lot of light on the current developments, and also to doing it on these technically constrained conditions. But it was a very, very interesting and enlightening talk. I want to thank our audience very much for waiting for us and also participating in the talk. We look very much forward to seeing you back in our future webinars. On the 5th of May, we will have a webinar focusing on the role of human rights defenders in this whole story about democratic backsliding. And on the 12th of May, we will turn our focus on current developments in the United States with a talk by Kim Lane-Shepler. Professor Cheeseman, thank you again very much for a very engaging and very interesting talk. Thank you to the audience, and we will be back in touch later on with a new webinar in our global series on democratic backsliding. Thank you.
My pleasure. And I'm sure it was all the better for people not having to see me. So thanks so much, and thanks for organizing the slides, and thanks for everyone who showed patience by sticking with us. Take care, everyone, and have a lovely day.
Thank you.